All right, welcome to today's Explainer. We are diving straight into a detailed, comprehensive report on the escalating geopolitical standoff between the United States and Iran. We're pulling directly from a recent broadcast segment that featured insights from Dr. Nasi Moynan. Now, she's an observer who actually fled Iran during the 1979 revolution, so she brings a deeply informed perspective. Together, we're going to unpack the current diplomatic gridlock, the internal power struggles happening behind closed doors, and, crucially, the stark on-the-ground reality for everyday Iranians.
Okay, let's dive into this with a core quote that really sets the stage for our entire report. Dr. Moynan stated in the broadcast, "We have huge leverage on Iran, no reason for us to rush into a deal." So, what does this actually mean? Well, she's pointing out that the U.S. is currently operating from a massive position of strength. They're effectively holding the cards in these high-stakes negotiations, just waiting for the pressure to force the other side's hand.
Here is the quick rundown for today's Explainer. First, we'll look at the negotiating standoff. Second, who runs the state. Third, inside the Mafia state. And finally, voices of the people. Let's get into it.
Starting right off with Section 1, the negotiating standoff and assessing the leverage.
When you map out the negotiating landscape based on the segment, the contrast is honestly night and day. The U.S. administration, they're taking their time. They are leaning heavily on significant economic and military leverage, operating from a very clear position of strength. But Iran, on the flip side, is described as being under extreme pressure. Dr. Moynan highlights this massive mismatch, not just in military firepower, but in economic stability, noting that robust civil institutions in Iran are pretty much non-existent right now.
So how is all that leverage translating into real-world policy? Well, according to the broadcast, the U.S. diplomatic strategy involves sending over a revised peace framework, but one that is packed with much tougher terms. The segment used this really interesting phrase to describe the U.S. approach: calculated aloofness. It's essentially saying, hey, come back to the table, but only when you're actually ready to concede. And politically, the administration is making a big bet. They're betting that Americans will be willing to endure temporary headaches, things like fluctuating gas prices, if it means getting an ironclad permanent solution, rather than just rushing into a half-measured deal.
Moving on to Section 2, who runs the state, the internal power dynamic.
If you're wondering who is actually sitting on the other side of that negotiating table, the central entity identified in this segment is the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Dr. Moynan notes it's getting harder to pinpoint exactly who to negotiate with, but her assessment is absolutely clear. The IRGC is the faction increasingly calling the shots. Even with other leadership figures in the mix day-to-day, the state has become incredibly militarized, and this specific military branch is the true power center dictating Iran's moves.
And now what's really interesting about this is the specific, highly charged term the guest uses to define the current Iranian government. She calls it a Mafia state. In the context of this report, that paints a picture of a heavily militarized regime run by the IRGC, one that operates totally outside the bounds of traditional government institutions. And crucially, they hold coercive control over massive global choke points, most notably the Strait of Hormuz. It's a stark term, but it really underscores the uncompromising grip this regime has.
Which brings us to Section 3, inside the Mafia state, the regime's core ambitions.
Drawing on 25 years of intensely observing the Iranian government, the guest gave this incredibly sobering assessment. She said, this is a regime that wants to stay in power at any cost. We aren't just talking about standard political survival here. This is presented as a hardline, zero-sum game. The government is reportedly willing to take extreme, uncompromising measures both at home and abroad, literally just to maintain their grip on control.
Building on that fierce survival instinct, the broadcast lays out the regime's alleged long-term objectives. Step 1, as we just mentioned, is maintaining internal power at any cost. But the guest issues a severe warning that the goals don't stop at Iran's borders. Step 2, she argues, is a foundational desire to replace Western civilization entirely. And Step 3 is the ultimate endgame, establishing a global Islamic caliphate. The report heavily stresses that negotiators can't forget these deeply rooted ideological motivations when dealing with the regime.
To maintain that kind of grip, the state relies on strict internal controls. The broadcast highlighted a massive digital divide inside the country. On one hand, you have the Iranian elite who reportedly enjoy completely unrestricted internet access, even during times of massive crackdowns and social unrest. But for the general public, it's a totally different story. They face intermittent, heavily restricted, and closely monitored access. The internet is basically manipulated as a tool of state observation. Citizens are painfully aware that whatever limited access they do get is likely being watched and listened to by the regime.
That leads us right into Section 4, Voices of the People, the on-the-ground reality.
And this brilliantly illustrates the staggering human cost of this geopolitical standoff. Pulling from communications with people actively fleeing the country, the guest reports truly devastating daily conditions. Everyday Iranians are facing severe joblessness, a completely failing national economy, and critical shortages of basic, life-saving medicines. And beyond the economic ruin, there's a massive human toll. The segment referenced historic massacres where an estimated 30,000 to 40,000 lives were lost. People who were simply fighting for the basic rights that so many in the West just take for granted.
Because of these incredibly dire conditions, Dr. Moynan drops a staggering estimate, 80% to 90%. Based on her contacts and observations, that is the massive percentage of the roughly 80 million people living in Iran who desperately want this current regime gone. They are reportedly determined that this has to be the end of the road for the current leadership. They are hoping for definitive change.
To really underscore that sheer level of desperation, the guest makes a truly startling claim. She reports that the suffering has gotten so intense that many citizens, and this is a direct quote, are happier being bombed for the hope of a democratic Iran than having to endure 47 more years of this regime. Wow. That is a heavy, sobering statement. We are impartially reporting this, but it stands as a massive testament to the extreme internal distress and exhaustion of the Iranian public, as relayed in the broadcast.
So, the crucial point we're left with is this. As the United States reportedly waits with calculated aloofness and tough terms, the nation sitting across the negotiating table is grappling with a collapsing economy and a public push to the absolute brink. What does this extreme internal desperation mean for the ultimate survival of the Iranian regime? And how will this fragile, highly militarized power dynamic shape the future of any potential global peace deal? It is a high-stakes standoff with millions of lives hanging in the balance. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll see you for the next report.